Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Graze Kokon. Let's get into the video. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about democracy, what it is, its history, and some of its limitations. So one of the most famous Democrats that we can think of is Winston Churchill. And he once said of democracy that it was the worst form of government, except for all others that have been tried from time to time. Now, why would he say something like that? What are the limitations of democracy? That's what we're going to go into in this video. Before we do, just going to give a massive shout out to, well, first of all, to my printer. Finally got that up and running. And also give a shout out to my friend Hugo for suggesting that instead of it being like at the beginning of the video, me being like, "Hello there. Welcome to Skeleton Key Production," and multiple different takes. He suggested just having it as one, and I think that it runs a lot more smoother. So if you like this video and you like some of the other videos and want to see more, I would definitely suggest liking, subscribing, and stay tuned for more videos. And also, light up the comment section with hopefully good comments. And if you have any respectful questions or debates or whatever you want to do in the comments, then please feel free. If you're just a hater, dab on the haters. So the word democracy comes from the Greek word for demos, kratos, yeah? So demos meaning people, kratos meaning power. So people power, power to the people, government for, by, and of the people, as Abraham Lincoln said. So, but what we think of democracy, a lot of us think that it began in ancient Greece, but in actual fact, if we look at the history, and that's what we're going to really delve into with this video, a lot of what we would describe as primitive democracy has really gone on since the dawn of civilization, if not earlier. So having systems whereby the leader of your tribe or your town or your empire, whatever, is having your leader being picked by the people or even by a handful of like important people and thing. It's that system goes back a long time. So you see examples of it in ancient Mesopotamia, in ancient Egypt. You see examples of it in Sparta, but each of these eventually fell to tyranny, right? Which is, for those who don't know, it's dictatorship essentially, yeah. Like where instead of power to the people, it's power in the hands of one man and his minions, basically, right? So this is the complexities with democracy. Some of its flaws seem to be that it always, if a careful check is not kept on it, it nearly always seems to go straight back to tyranny. So we're going to look into why in this video. So what we refer to as Athenian democracy is the first example of a society being run by purely democratic means. So in ancient Athens, at around the time of 594 BC, so that's well over 2,500 years ago. So you had in ancient Athens, you had aristocracy, right? So you had a tiny elite group of people running the show, and this elite group was overthrown by Solon in 594, and over the next century or so, we start to see the development of what we refer to as Athenian democracy. So and the high point of this was with Celophanes. I'm sorry for butchering the name. So that was in 510 BC, and he's the first one who started actually labeling it as Democratus, yeah, as I just said. So this is when the male citizenry of ancient Athens were able to come together and start making laws and making decisions for the ancient city-state. And like they started setting up a code of laws by which the people of Athens would live by. And this culminated with the leadership of Pericles in 460 BC, whereby the citizens of Athens were chosen by lot, right? So they were chosen at random, and so imagine you have like the equivalent of like a parliament, right? But instead of you electing representatives, whether it's MPs or congressmen, etc., instead of that system, that it'd be a system where random members of the public would be chosen, and they would be the officials, right? They would be the politicians essentially, for I think a period of a year, and during that year they would have the power to the power would be in their hands to make the laws of Athens. Now, before we get into this, we just have to say with a massive caveat that even within this democratic society, it was still a situation whereby only adult male citizens of Athens had the right to vote. So this excluded women and it excluded slaves, who made up a huge proportion of the Athenian society. So in actual fact, when we talk about Athenian democracy, even at its high point, you're only talking about a relatively small section of the population who actually had the right to vote. But even in these early times, you still had many critics of the system, notably with Socrates, followed by Plato, Aristotle, and many other of the great Greek philosophers that we think of. And all of them criticized Athenian democracy. But why? So the best way to think of it is this, right? So this analogy was used. So if you have a ship sailing on the ocean, on the open oceans, right? Who would you have being the captain of that ship? The argument from these philosophers and by many other critics of democracy would be that the most talented person, the person who's best able to be a captain of the ship, the person with the most knowledge, etc., they ought to be the captain of the ship. However, they criticise democracy as saying, actually, in democracy, it would just be the most popular person who would be chosen. So they might not necessarily be a good captain, but they might, like if they gave all of the sailors rum and let them party every single day, then they might curry favour in that sense. And so it wouldn't necessarily be the best person running the ship, but it would be, just the most popular person. Now, on a wider scale, this is what they criticised. They said that the government should not be a government chosen by the people. It should not be a government run by the people, because the people, they didn't have much faith in ordinary people, and they believed that the mob would essentially, pick politicians and pick laws that favoured themselves rather than what was actually virtuous, rather than what was actually helpful to the Athenian state. And yeah, so this is some of the criticisms that you see of it, and also you even in the modern times you see people saying people didn't know what they voted for, stupid, this, that, and these are all criticisms of democracy that people have. So yeah, we really have to look into some of the validity of that, and also just some of the wider history of democracy. And even Athenian democracy, twice within the space of 200 years that it was active for, the people of Athens voted against their own democratic constitution. Now, in both those cases, they were coerced by outside forces. I believe by one time it was the Persians, and the other times it was by the Spartans. But still, it was a thing of the people of Athens, depending on what was happening, could very quickly end up overthrowing the very system that had given them power in the first place, in order to essentially give more power to a tiny elite. And this is part of the reason why the system of Athenian democracy slowly decayed over time. People lost faith in the system, and a lot of historians and political commentators today have commented on some of the parallels of ancient Athenian democracy and the current state that we have in the Western world at the moment. And people say that the parallels between the two, where people are starting to lose faith in the system, where people are going more and more towards a tiny elite of people like with experts and stuff running the country. And these are very prescient and very valuable debates which are happening in the Western world right now. And it's something that will shape how we interact with the political system throughout the whole of our lifetime. Now, ancient Rome also tried. Ancient Rome was very much almost, you could think of ancient Rome as the kind of copy and paste masters of ancient Greece. Yeah. So what they tended to do is they looked at what the ancient Greece were doing and said, "Oh, we like that. We'll take some of that." And what they did is essentially they merged the political systems in many different Greek city-states and kind of came together. Well, this is with regard to the early Roman Republic, And so in the early Roman Republic, what you would have is two consuls, So these people would basically be the executives, So you can think of it almost like having two presidents, or having a president and a prime minister, as you have in many countries at the moment. So you have that as the executives. This is the person who's in charge. Then you have the Senate, which are basically aristocrats. So one can think of this in terms of the current House of Lords in the British system, and how the U.S. Senate was up until 1913 when they changed it so that ordinary people could actually elect senators. Before then, it was people were appointed by the states where they came from. And finally, you had the assemblies, right? So this is what we could think of as our current House of Commons and the House of Representatives in America. And so it was a mixed democracy as such. It was a mixture of different concepts, whereby you had the executive, you had the aristocracy, and you had the kind of like democratic assemblies, whereby power was dispersed. So for instance, having two consuls meant that instead of there just being one guy in charge, it's the two of them have to work together and play off each other in order to basically secure the liberty of the people of Rome. And when the US founding fathers were coming up with their constitution, it was a thing where they looked at ancient Greece, they looked at ancient Rome as a really big influence, and a lot of what you see in modern democracies is basically copying what was done in the ancient Roman Republic. But just as we saw with ancient Greece, we also saw that the ancient Roman Republic also went down the same road. So if any of you read the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar, you will see how after the death of Caesar, the whole state descends into civil war, and what ends up arising out of the ashes of that is the first emperor with Emperor Augustus, which is where we get the month of August from. So once again we see a democratic system collapsing and a tyranny arising from that, right? And the Roman Empire at that point continued on until the fall of Rome, and throughout the rest of that time you had despotic emperors, one after the other, becoming less and less competent in what they were doing. The only reason why they rise to power is because they had the backing of the army, and then as soon as the army would change to someone else, then there'd be another overthrow, and then another person would be put in, and it just became a very chaotic system, and people started to lose faith in the Roman Empire. And this is part of the reason why over many centuries the Roman Empire came and fell. But it was a thing where places which had not been conquered by Rome, such as ancient Germany, basically, in there where the Romans had not conquered yet, but where there was a lot of influence. In the tribal societies that we had in Germany, we had, you know, democratic systems there. In many German places, they had what was called a thing, right? That's the actual name for it, a thing. So this was basically, we can almost think of it as like kind of early parliaments, yeah. So you'd have the king of a tribe, and his thing would be his noblemen surrounding him, and it's a thing of the king, you know, could act in a certain regard, but he'd also have to listen to his advisors, and he couldn't do things which took power away and took the liberty away from from these nobles. And you know, we start to see this with Anglo-Saxon England. So after the fall of Rome, the Germanic tribes from, you know, like the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and all those kind of people, right, came from Germany and from modern day Holland and settled in England, and that's where we get the term England from, land of the Angles. You know, so it's Anglo-Saxon England, right, and it's where most of our language comes from. So in that system, we had in each of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, you had something that's called a witan, and again, this is what we can think of as a very early form of parliament that we've all come to know and either love or detest. So once again, it was a thing of the king being held accountable by his nobles, and he couldn't do things that the nobles didn't agree with, and you know, and so there were some checks and balances on the absolute power of the king, which was very much in contrast to how it was done all around the rest of the world, whereby, you know, if you're the king, you're just in charge, and everyone has to listen to what you do. And so within the kind of Germanic and Anglo-Saxon culture, you had this early checks and balances. Now, for many people, there's a bit of a misconception of this period. Yeah? We refer to it as the Dark Ages, refer to it as, you know, we think of like medieval times as really a backward time, but actually both technological improvements greatly continued after the fall of Rome, and also political developments also continued. And you know, even after the Norman conquest of Anglo-Saxon England, right? You know, in 1066, we still see that the system that was in place ended up having, you know, the system that the conquered people of England had before the Normans, yeah, ended up filtering up and influencing the conquerors, right? And so, you know, we see this with magnacarta in 1215. So this is the first time where the the noblemen of the French origin noblemen have the same kind of idea as the people who they'd previously conquered, where they went, hold on, King John is moving like tyrannical, you know, he's moving like a tyrant, and he needs to be kept in check, right? And that's what Magna Carta is, if you ever hear about it. Magna Carta is basically saying that the king might be in charge, but he is still held accountable by the people below him, and he cannot deprive them of liberty without due process of the law, right? And you know, this led to the first proper parliament we think of in 1265 in England, and you start seeing across much of Europe, we start to see the development of parliamentary systems. So even in Poland, you have what was known as the Golden Liberty in 1569, and you know, across many different states, you start to see the development of this kind of early form of not necessarily democracy in the way we'd think about it, but some form of parliamentary system where at least some people had a say in how the government should be run. Now, I really don't want to give the idea that, you know, the phenomenon of democracy is purely a European phenomenon, because what we can see with the Native Americans, what we can see with ancient African societies, many other places around the world, we start to also see this kind of these democratic societies arise. So notably, we could find with the Native Americans, we could find the Iroquois Confederacy. So this is a group of Indian tribes in the northeast of the modern day US, right? And these tribes came together and worked together and kind of said, right, for mutual defense, we will come together for decision making. We'll come together, right? So each tribe was still able to make its own decisions, independently of the others, but on matters where it benefited them to all come together, they would all come together. And this confederacy, we don't know fully when it arose. The historians kind of say anytime between 1000 AD and 1450 AD, which not very precise. That's like a period of almost 500 years, but anyway, right? So basically before there was an English Parliament, before there was any of these kind of things, right? We start seeing very independently of anything to do with Europe. We start seeing these societies pop up, and the Iroquois Confederation lasted well into the early modern era, which is why the founding fathers of America, when they were drafting their constitution and they were thinking about the different powers that the different states would have, they looked to the Iroquois Confederation and thought, right, that's actually a good model, because we have states like New York, we have states like Virginia, we have all these different states with competing interests. So how do we bring them all together in a way where they're still able to be independent, but when they need to come together on certain issues, they can still come together? And so the founding fathers were really influenced by the Iroquois Confederacy. And then on top of that, where part of my family are from is the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria, right? And amongst them, as opposed to many of the other tribes in Nigeria and the surrounding area, which tended to be either kind of theocratic, so that they were run by religious authorities, or you had dictatorial tyrannical kind of like systems, right? But amongst the Igbo, you had quasi-democratic society whereby people there were able to have an input on the governing of the tribe, essentially, so really want to press this concept that democracy is not a European idea, right? It's spanned all societies all around, well, not all societies, but it spanned the world, right? The ancient Aztecs had elements of it. Many societies have had elements of it, okay? So really get this idea out of your head that when you think of democracy, you think of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, because while what we think of in terms of it developed kind of political theory arose from these societies, you see many places completely independent of their influence also having some of these ideas. So now we're gonna jump back to Europe real quick, and we're gonna start to look at how some of the foundations of the parliamentary system that we have really start to get really entrenched, right? So in England, you started having you had a king who was called King Charles I, right? And he believed that he had, the divine right of kings. He believed that God himself had set him on the earth to rule, right? And so that mindset, that kind of megalomaniac kind of mindset, when all of a sudden you've got a parliament, that you're somewhat accountable to, and you have to go and be like, please can I have money for this war, please can I have money for X, Y, Z, right? It becomes very problematic, and the tensions of that conflict, right, ended up sparking the English Civil War, which went on from 1642 to 1649, and ultimately ended up with Parliament side winning under Oliver Cromwell, and the king getting his head chopped off. So during this time, you had the king versus Parliament. But then the ordinary people, the soldiers who were fighting this war, they were caught up in the middle of it. Because Parliament in those days were a very, very selected group of noblemen and people of great power and influence. And they're the only people who had a say in England. So while we were fighting this huge, huge civil war where, untold numbers of English people end up dying in this war, right? Never mind the Scots and the Irish, etc., right? This was a devastating conflict, right? More, proportionally speaking, more British people died during this civil war than in any other conflict, even World War One or World War Two, right? So in that regard, it was a very bloody conflict. But for the ordinary people, they were kind of saying, well, hold on. Regardless of whether a king rules things or whether it's a tiny elite of people in Parliament running things, we the people do not have a say in how the government should be run. And so this is what you started seeing with the arrival of the levelers, yeah. So these were kind of early really advocates for universal suffrage, yeah. So the universal right of people to vote and stuff, right? So regardless of what your rank in society were, that you had a right to vote. So I'm going to read a quote from you now from Thomas Rainsborough, right? It's a very long quote, so that's why I'm reading it. I'm not going to be able to remember it otherwise. So in 1646, you had something known as the Putney debates, right? So this is where different people from the army came together and were debating about the different, what kind of system we'd want after the Civil War, right? And in a second, you'll see why both the royalists and the parliamentarians really, really opposed these people, right? Because what they were advocating for was something really revolutionary for the time. So, the poorest he that is in England have a life to live as the greatest he. And therefore, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under government ought first to be to by his own consent to, I can't read my own handwriting, to put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not bound to a strict sense to that government that he hath not had a voice to put himself under. So that's really revolutionary. Yeah? So to put that in modern terms, every single person, regardless of whether they're rich or poor, has a life to live, right? And from that life, they should be entitled to the same liberties that every single person has in the country. And that if you had no choice, if you had no voice in who that government should be, then why you have no moral obligation to live under the rules of that system, right? So really, really revolutionary stuff. This is stuff that really ties into the American Revolution, which we'll touch upon in a second, right? Because this was essentially the same argument that they had. They said, hold on, we have no say in how this government is run, and yet you're forcing us to live under its demands, right? We are under no moral obligation to listen to any government which we had no say in electing. Now, let's not take this to an extreme. Just because, say for instance, an election, if your side didn't win the election, that doesn't mean that you just get to overthrow things and be like, I'm not going to listen to that government because I didn't vote for it. What that means is you at least had the freedom to be part of that system, yeah. And if your side lost, well, tough, your side lost, right? But it's a thing where if you didn't have any right to talk in that government at all, if you're a full-grown adult and you have no right to talk in that government, you should not have to listen to what the government's saying, because this is not a government for, by, and of the people, yeah. And therefore, it's perfectly within your right to overthrow that government. And this is, again, some of the really revolutionary stuff we see with the American Revolution. So, when we start seeing in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson talking about how we believe these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain rights, and among these rights are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that, I can't remember the exact thing. Long and short, he basically says that anyone, it's kind of the same thing that Thomas Rainsborough was saying, a century before, whereby if people have no say in that government, then they don't have to listen to that government, right? And it's their duty to overthrow that government and to create a new government in its place, which can actually govern them through legitimate means. But just because Thomas Jefferson and other people like this advocated this kind of like revolutionary like message, it was still a thing where the founding fathers still had a view that was very, very skeptical of democracy. So with the exception of people like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, it was a thing where many of the founding fathers were themselves very wealthy landowners, and they, obviously, like, they were slave owners, many of them, and businessmen, etc., etc. So when they were writing the US Constitution, or when they were in the midst of kind of writing it, you start seeing in what was known as the Federalist Papers, right, whereby some of them, such as Hamilton, so go and watch like Hamilton for some kind of idea on that. You start seeing Madison, and you see John Jay, right? So these three people wrote the Federalist Papers, and their whole argument was, and especially you see this in I believe in Madison, in Federalist Paper number 10, you see arguments against democracy, right? So the American founding fathers, like I said before, looked at ancient Greece, looked at ancient Rome, and thought, right, if we have a pure democracy, what's going to happen is there's a tiny opulent minority, right? So like the tiny group of rich people, and then we've got the masses as such, right? So if we have a purely democratic system, what's going to end up happening is these people are going to use their collective like kind of power to just vote to be like, yo, we want all the money from this tiny elite, right? And so their argument was that the point of government was to protect that tiny elite of people from having their property kind of like stolen by the masses, right? So, and this is tied in with how important life, liberty, and property is. Yeah, so like if you have a system whereby it's basically just mob rule, or as the ancient Greeks would call it, oclacy. I really struggled to pronounce it. Yeah, oclacy. Yeah, so rule by the mob, basically, right? So if you have that kind of system where then there can be no liberty. Yeah? Then it's literally just right. We're a majority. We're voting to take away the rights of that minority, and that could be for all different things. That could be religious minorities. That could be racial minorities. That could be anything, right? If you have a system whereby the majority of people have the ability to take away rights from the minority, then you don't really have a free system. All you have is this kind of system where at any point people can stir up tensions, people can stir up hatred, and just say, right, that minority there, they are the problem. We need to take money from them, we need to kick them out, we need to kill them, etc., right? So it can lead to a very, very dangerous system, and oftentimes you will have people rising up, you will have tyrannical people rising up on the coattails of that kind of like, for lack of a better word, populist message. And so a lot of people will exploit that and ride their way to power. So this was some of the things that the American founding fathers warned against, and that's why they said that you need to have a constitutional republic whereby you had power kept in different places, and you made it very difficult for people to make huge fundamental changes, right? So changes could happen, but it'd have to be, 2/3 majority, it'd have to be 3/4 of states, etc., etc. It'd have to be, for there to be a change, it'd have to have not just a simple majority, it'd have to have a super majority, whereby it's like 60%, 66.66%, or or 75%, whatever. You need to have more than just a simple majority in order to have some really fundamental changes. And this is some of the checks and balances which the American founding fathers had in order to try and secure their republic, because they were well aware that as we see with ancient Greece, as we see with ancient Rome, as we see with many other places, right? They said that the lifespan of a democratic society is normally about 200 to 300 years. And they wanted the American Republic to last much longer than that. And at the moment, we see that America is less than 250 years old, and already some of the fundamental cracks, some of the systems that are in place, we start to see the fundamental cracks within that system already. So I'm not saying that America's going to collapse in the next 50 or 100 years, but it's a thing of, even with a constitutional republic such as the United States is, it still is very, very problematic. And just to illustrate this point of how opposed to democracy the founding fathers were, the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence. It does not appear once in the Constitution. And the only time in any kind of constitutional papers where it mentions it at all is, as I said, the Federalist Papers, and every argument in there for democracy is an argument against it, right? So when people say that America is democracy, this is fundamentally not true. And you can even see this with the Electoral College, right? People think that they vote for president. In actual fact, what happens a month or so after the actual election is you have a group of 538 electors who are chosen by the different state legislatures, and they're actually the people who elect the president. So if a majority of people decided that they wanted to have this person being the president, if majority of the people if the majority of the electoral college, decided, nope, we want to elect someone else, they could have done that. And they could have done it in 2016, they could do it in 2020, they could do it any election, because constitutionally, that is the power that they have, right? Constitutionally, the people do not elect the US president. These electors, most of which people don't know who they are, etc., they are actually the people who pick the president. So we're not trying to get all conspiracy theorist, but this is actually the reality of the US system. However, we do see in other places around the world, we do see examples of how a democracy can work. So for instance, in Switzerland, you have, a much looser, rather than it being a federal system, you have a confederate system, much like how we had with the Iroquois Confederation, and many of them were influenced by the same kind of idea from them. So in Switzerland, the different cantons, the different districts within Switzerland, they get to vote on a whole range of issues, and if 1% of the population in that region send a petition and say we want to have a referendum on this, then it gets done, right? And the people can vote on it, and if the majority of people want that, then it happens, right? And they have, you have local referendums and you have nationwide referendums. So for instance, Switzerland, both in 1994 and in 2001, had referendums on joining the EU, and in both times the people of Switzerland rejected EU membership, right? So that was perfectly within the power of the Swiss people, right? But at the same time, they still operate under a constitutional system. So if people decided, right, we want to do some crazy stuff, I can't even think of an example. You use your imagination. There's countless examples you can think of. Whereby people might say, right, we want to round up all this and that people and kill them or whatever, right? So any referendum which deprives people of their liberties, there are checks and balances on that. So even if the majority of Swiss people wanted to do X, Y, Z, if it fundamentally strips people of their freedoms, then there are checks against that to not allow that to be implemented. So, you can still have a system where you have a great deal of democratic say, and even in many of the US states, right, you have ballot initiatives, you have the different states coming up, the people there having a say on what the policy of the state should be, but at the end of the day, you still have the state electors who can say whether they want that to go ahead or not. So again, this check and balances between the good things within democracy and also limitations on some of its excesses. So now we start seeing the rise of democracy in around like the 1840s, up until that period to about 1920s, right? So in developed Western democracies such as Britain and the US, you start to see a movement away from having this tiny elite of people deciding things still, to the franchise being expanded to more and more people, right? So you start to see the Chartist movement, like in Britain, really advocating for universal suffrage, so the right of all people to vote, or all adults rather, and bit by bit, over many decades, the 1880s and 1890s, etc., you start to see the franchise expanded down towards the middle classes, etc., etc. In America, the rights of people, to vote started to expand as well. But also there were many restrictions. Obviously, slaves could not vote, and the franchise was denied to African Americans after the end of slavery, with many of the kind of Jim Crow laws and the intimidations made against them by white supremacists in those states, so it's a bit of a patchy situation when we start thinking about democracy in Britain and the US. We can't really think of it up until about, by some measures, this country and America have not been democratic for even really the last maybe 100 years. Maybe you could make that argument, the last 100 years we've been somewhat democratic, right? So during the run up to World War One, we start to see suffrage movement, women's suffrage movements across the English speaking world and across many other places around the world. And bit by bit, places like New Zealand, Australia, etc., some of the US states, and bit by bit, slowly, we start to see more and more places giving women the right to vote. And World War One was a really, really pivotal moment in the minds of the British people and the American people, right? Because working class people in Britain were sent to fight, and yet they had no right to vote. And that's something that often gets forgotten. So in 1918, women get the right to vote in Britain for the first time. Well, property owning, middle class women above the age of 30 who are married, they get the right to vote in 1918. But it's at least something, right? Working class men who had fought and died in wars and etc., they also only got the right to vote in 1918, right? So in a situation where, the franchise up until that point was literally just wealthy men, and that was it. And then by 1928 in Britain, we start to see all adults, regardless of class, regardless of marital status, regardless of anything. In 1928, that is when all adults above the age of 21 finally get the right to vote in Britain. So when we think about this being a democratic society, we really, if we're honest, have to start with 1928, because everything before that, the franchise was very limited towards people. And in America, we have women's suffrage in 1920, and we don't start seeing, until the civil rights movement, we don't start seeing African Americans in many US states having the right to vote, really up until the 1960s. So again, when we start to think about some of the wider societal issues that we face at the current time, we have to bear in mind that people within living memory in the the United States, were deprived of their basic rights as citizens to take part in the democratic process, right? So very, very recent phenomenon for many of them. So now we start to see, throughout the decades, we start to see more and more societies becoming democratic, especially towards like with decolonization, with with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with many different uprisings across the world, we start to see more and more countries becoming democratic, especially in like the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, right? So it started becoming more and more the norm, whereby governments were democratic, and even places like North Korea at least will pretend to be democratic, yeah, because no one wants to be seen as undemocratic. And the right of women to vote, we're going to start talking about the history of feminism in a later video, so we'll go into more depth in it there. But even Saudi Arabia has given some women the right to vote only very, very recently in the last few years, right? So it's a very long process. The struggle for people to have the right to vote is a very long, drawn out process, and it's not fully finished for a lot of people. The problem that we are facing in modern times is the rise of authoritarian regimes, right? So countries like Turkey, countries like Russia, which are democracies in name only, where in reality you have more and more power going into the hands of the president, and we start to see the erosion of many of the liberal checks and balances that we see in other countries. And this is a real threat to our way of life, because during this time of democratic hegemony, we have seen living standards vastly increase. We have seen, we've seen great benefits to people's lives, and we have also seen a great reduction in the amount of wars that we are fighting, right? So you might see on the news there's wars and conflicts, etc., but in the grand scheme of things, this is the most peaceful time we've ever had in existence. And the reason for this is because, with very few exceptions, we have not seen democracies go to war with one another. There have been some examples in Latin America and a few other places, right, where places have gone to war with each other, but by and large, the pull factor that populations have with each other, right, it means that anytime a democratic state is getting close to going to war with another, the populations in each put pressure on the government, and so there's more dialogue and there's less chance of the nations going to war with each other. So the preservation of liberal democracy is important, not just for our prosperity, not just for our liberty, but also for world peace. That doesn't mean that we should go to countries which are not democracies and enforce democracy on them. But it does mean that the preservation of it in the states which are democratic is of a vital importance. Now, as Milton Friedman, who's an economist we will talk about in a later video, said, if 51% of people vote to shoot the other 49%, that is not a moral system. Democracy in and of itself is great, but it's not perfect. And this goes back to what we said at the beginning of the video, the Churchill quote, that it's the worst form of government except all others that have been tried, right? If we don't have liberal democracy, then the excesses of democracy end up, becoming mob rule. And that is something that we really have to guard against, right? Faith in our democratic systems are, being eroded over time, and we really have to have value in it, and we have to respect both the side that wins and the side that loses. Because as George Washington said, if we start having factionalism, if we start having people being divided, then a house divided cannot stand. And this is why it's really important that we preserve democracy, but also recognise its limitations. And that's also why it's really important to like, comment, and subscribe for this channel, because we're creating really great content and we've got many more planned. And if you really like this format, this is the beginning of the political theory series. So we're going to go into this same level of depth with a lot of different things. So the next video is going to be about liberalism, next one's going to be conservatism, socialism, etc., right? So really stay tuned for the thing, really stay tuned for this channel, because we've got a whole lot more planned, and it's really, hopefully it's been enlightening to people. And have a great day, and bye.